So justice is messy at best. Justice is injustice at worst. And so that's some of the history that I hope to bring together in the telling of this story.
You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out for beer during commercials because the revolution will not be televised.
My interest in this particular subject, the broader context of this subject of race and criminal justice, has to do quite possibly just with the fact that I came of age during the civil rights era. I was born in 1957, and I have still vivid memories of the civil rights movement as it was playing out in the media on a daily basis in the early 1960s, the images that were on the TV screen, on the TV news every night. And so these were left an indelible impression, and I guess I somehow got it into my head that this was a central narrative of the American story, and I carried that with me in the years and decades later. I also remember this era of the Black Panther Party later in the 1960s, even though I was just a 10 or 11-year-old kid at the time. Again, the images of this era, the images of the Black Panther Party were so vivid, and they played out so dramatically in popular culture at the time that these things left an impression. And so, as I began a career as a journalist and a writer, these issues of race and criminal justice always were important to me.
Right.
You know, when I was writing this book, there's so many times I almost reached out to you just to go over this history.
Yeah, that's...
I never got around to it because I was so busy dealing with direct sources, you know, Whitmore.
Tell me about it. I know the drill. It's something else,
but
man.
I just kept, I could have used your wisdom and your sense of history because I kept saying to myself, like things like, for instance, the '64 riot here in Harlem. I kept thinking, wow, nobody talks about this anymore.
Sure.
It's like history that was so vivid in its day when it was happening, and now it's completely forgotten. And as a New Yorker, living here in New York and getting a sense of the history of New York, I began to realize that there were really important aspects of the recent racial history of the city that either had been allowed to be forgotten or had been deliberately and conveniently swept under the rug because much of this history is unpleasant and untidy and requires a conversation that in many ways people are not willing to have, and we still really haven't had.
But what's encouraging, though, along with your book, is an interest and a concern that's coming from credible, exceptionally credible sources where people can begin to gather some notion. I was looking at Jonathan Gill's book. Have you seen that one?
Yeah.
On Harlem?
I haven't read it, but
yeah.
I've seen it.
And Sharifa Rose Fitzhurst's book, you know, and Michelle Alexander,
Yes.
The New Jim Crow, and
And the warmth of
Isabel Wilkerson, The Warmth of Other Suns.
I
mean, it's just what was the other one? The Henrietta Lacks book?
Yes.
That, I mean,
Yes.
it's just been a plethora of
Really
books coming
essential
out there that are very, very, I think, taken together. I think we have a good, solid understanding of a lot of historical stuff.
The specific historical incident that brought me to this subject matter was the story of what was called the Wiley Hoffert murders, the Career Girls murders. Two white women who were murdered on the very day that Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech. And it was a very sensational crime. They were savagely stabbed multiple times. One of them was sexually molested. It was a horrific crime, and there was a lot of pressure on the police to find a culprit. And months went by, and they really didn't have much to go on. You know, this was the pre-DNA era. They had a very bloody crime scene, but they didn't have much in the way of evidence. And so, to make a long story short, 7 or 8 months later, way out in Brooklyn, far away from the scene of the crime, a young black kid named George Whitmore, 19 years old, not very well educated, not very sophisticated kid, volunteered some information to a cop on the street one night about an incident that he'd seen the night before in the neighborhood. And the cop said, well, that's interesting. Why don't you come back to the precinct and we'll talk about it. And they brought George Whitmore back to the local precinct in Brooklyn, and they proceeded to interrogate him over the course of the next 24 hours. And by the time they were done with George Whitmore, they had gotten him to sign a 62-page confession, the longest confession in the history of the New York Police Department, confessing to a series of crimes, confessing to the incident which he was attempting to supply them information about, confessing to the murder of a black woman that had happened a couple of blocks away from the precinct, and more importantly, they got him to confess to this notorious double murder, the Career Girls murders. So the saga of George Whitmore, his false confession and his long journey to clear his name, was for me the initial focus. And in fact, I thought I was going to do a book just on that, but as I began to write about Whitmore's legal saga, because he goes through a number of trials over the next 10 years, and he really goes through a kind of process of slow torture at the hands of the judicial system. But I asked myself, at the same time that was going on, what else was happening with race and criminal justice in this city? And the answer to that, of course, was that all hell breaks loose.
Some young emerging scholars out there who got their eyes on the prize and really looking back to make sense out of some stuff, look at the strengths and weaknesses of different organizations, institutions, individuals, and that just has to be done. Mm-hmm.
Well, the roots of it, the thing to me that was so important about the research that I was doing for this book was it deals very specifically with the point of contention between the black community and law enforcement. Period. As I was investigating the Whitmore story, I asked myself, well, what else was happening in the city in terms of race and criminal justice during that 10-year period? And so then I thought, well, I need to find some other characters that are going through a life journey during this 10-year period that would reflect on other aspects of this very complicated dynamic that was playing out during this period. So I came across a cop by the name of Bill Phillips. Bill Phillips was a dirty cop. Bill Phillips was a dirty cop almost from the day he came on the job. He was the son of a dirty cop. And Bill Phillips was not a rogue cop. You often hear in the news when they refer to a corrupt cop, they say he was a rogue cop, as if he was off on his own doing corruption, as if he was one bad apple in the bushel. Well, Bill Phillips was anything but that. He was operating within a system of corruption that was deeply entrenched in the New York City Police Department, had been for generations. And this was so deeply entrenched in the police culture that they didn't even think of it as corruption. They didn't even refer to it as corruption. It's just the way things were done and the way things had been done for generations. And here's how I met Dhoruba. I was interviewed by Dredd for the last book I did, which was a book about the mob in Cuba before the revolution in 1950. And after that interview was over, Dredd asked me what I was working on next. And I had begun to lay out this book, and I had kind of determined that I was going to try to tell Whitmore's story, and that I needed to tell the story of a dirty cop, and that was Bill Phillips. And I had spent a long time looking far and wide before I had decided that Dhoruba bin Wahad would be a great character to have in this story. This was before I ever met Dhoruba. Now, I thought Dhoruba was living in Ghana at the time. I thought he was in Africa, so I was thinking, how the hell am I going to find Dhoruba? And Dred Scott asked me, what are you working on next? And I begin to describe this book in vague terms without naming any of the main characters. And Dred says, well, have you ever met Dhoruba bin Wahad?
Well, since I got out of prison in 1990, I believe, I managed to win a few cases against the state, and I moved to Africa. But I guess more importantly, personally, I got married and I had the opportunity to have two very beautiful young boys, and so we've been living in Africa all of these years. We're here in the United States now. My wife is finishing studies, and then we'll be going back to Africa. And I think people really don't understand that the struggle that we are undergoing today for democratic rights and for freedom and for freedom from systems of exploitation is a global struggle that is going on right now. Problem with me because, you know, when you look at the people who were in power with George Bush, when you look at the people who have been the architects of the national security state as we now know it, the people who have allowed and created the new Jim Crow that Michelle Alexander talks about, they were my contemporaries. They were the very people who tried to shut down the revolutionary consciousness that America was moving to in 1968. Look, who was Bush's defense secretary? What was his name? The second Bush. Donald Rumsfeld, all of these guys. I'm 66 years old. How old is he?
He's probably 10 years older than that.
Yeah, but the whole generation that repressed the movements of the 60s are the same ones that have been exercising power in this country for the past 20, 30 years. And so when TJ talked about the police and corruption and how they systematically set out to create a preserve, so to speak, in which they could practice their corruption as law enforcement, and at the same time serve greater white society purpose of keeping people of color in check. And what I really got out of the book that TJ was trying to write is that this is not just something that he's writing about in history. This is something that I can use as an activist to show how the New York City Police Department translated a demand for decentralization into the Community Police Review Board, a totally useless appendage of the police department. How did they persuade the black community in New York City to go for it? And when we look at black leaders, when we look at the black clergy in this city, we see how they did it. And they're the same ones that broker the Democratic and Republican power in this city today in the black community. I don't have to mention names. We know who they are. We know who represents Harlem. We know who was the governor of the state of New York. Okay? Who no one in upstate New York, none of the power bases that rely on the criminal justice system supported. But a little thing that's known is that the reason why we have the police department that we have today that stops tens of thousands of our children every day for no reason, stop and sit. You can stand out in Harlem on a Friday, Saturday night and watch how the police harass these young kids. Yeah, the boys is walking around with their pants around their butt. What does that mean? You're supposed to be thrown on the ground and searched and abused by local law enforcement? That's what that means? What we haven't begun to come to grips with is how we've accepted the police state in our midst under the pretext that it's protecting us. And it was black politicians, and it was the drug war, and it was the war on crime that created this dynamic. And one of the things that we fail to fully appreciate is that the police department is institutionally racist.
Been telling you, sometimes I'm like the only person I feel safe to tell it to. I'm locked inside a cell in me. I know that there's a gel in you. Consider this shit belling out, so take a breath and hell a few. My screams is finally getting free. My thoughts is finally yelling down.